Elias Thorne's cold fingers fumbled with the last snare wire. He needed one more good pelt to trade for winter salt and flour down in Aspen Creek. A low growl from the aspens reminded him he was not the only hunter on this mountain. An empty larder meant a lean, brutal winter alone. Failure meant facing the long, silent months with nothing but memories for company. The cold was a constant companion, a presence that settled deep in a man's bones. Elias worked with a practiced economy of motion, his movements honed by a decade of solitude in the high country. The sun was already dipping behind the jagged peaks, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple. He finished setting the wire, hiding it carefully with a dusting of fresh powder and a few scattered pine needles. He stood, his joints cracking in protest, and scanned the darkening tree line. The wolf was smart. He knew that much. It had been shadowing him for 2 days, always just out of rifle range, a ghost of gray fur and hungry eyes. It was a waiting game, and in these mountains, patience was the currency of survival. He gathered his pack and his long rifle, the familiar weight a small comfort against his back. The journey back to his cabin was a slow trudge through deepening snow, each step a deliberate push against the mountain's will to hold him. Elias had built the cabin himself, nestled in a small meadow protected by a granite ridge. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the bruised sky. It was a sturdy place, built of thick pine logs he had felled and shaped with his own hands. Inside, the small space was orderly and spare. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a bed frame with a straw mattress another. Shelves held a few tins, a bag of beans, and a small stack of worn books. He stoked the fire, the flames leaping up to lick the seasoned logs. The warmth began to push back the chill, a slow and welcome tide. He prepared a simple meal of dried venison and hardtack softened in hot water, eating slowly as he stared into the fire. The silence of the cabin was profound, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the moan of the wind outside. It was a silence he was used to, but tonight it felt heavier, colder. He thought of the wolf, its intelligent eyes watching from the shadows. The mountain was a place of stark truths, and the clearest one was that everything was hungry. The next morning, Elias rose before dawn. A fresh layer of snow had fallen overnight, blanketing the world in a pristine silence. He checked his snares first, his snowshoes making a soft crunching sound. The first 2 were empty. The third held a large rabbit, its fur a perfect winter white. It was enough for several meals, but not the trade pelt he needed. He reset the snare and moved on to the last one, the one he had set yesterday evening near the creek. As he approached the thicket of willows where he'd placed the wire, he saw that the snow was disturbed, but the tracks were not the familiar paw prints of the wolf, nor the delicate trail of a fox. They were small, impossibly small, as if a child had wandered through the deep snow. Elias frowned, his hand going to the knife on his belt. No settler family lived this high up, and the Ute tribes kept to the lower valleys in the cold months. He followed the tracks, his hunter's caution warring with a growing sense of unease. They led him down to the frozen creek where they stopped. There, half hidden by a snow-covered log, was a small bundle of rags. He approached slowly, his rifle ready. The bundle did not move. He knelt, pushing aside the tattered wool blanket. A small face, pale and still, looked up at the gray sky. It was a child, a girl no older than 5 or 6, her dark hair matted with ice. For a moment he thought she was gone, another life claimed by the mountain's cold indifference. Then he saw it, a faint cloud of vapor escaping her blue lips. She was alive. The sight sent a jolt through him, a feeling he hadn't felt in years, not since he had buried his own wife and son. He swept the small girl into his arms, her body shockingly light. He wrapped her in his own thick coat and began the desperate journey back to the cabin, his own needs forgotten. The wolf, the pelts, the town, none of it mattered now. He had a different kind of survival to fight for. The girl was burning with fever, her small body shivering uncontrollably in his arms. The mountain had given him something he never expected. It had given him a life to save. His cabin, once a fortress of solitude, now felt like a sanctuary. He had a purpose beyond his own quiet existence. Anyone listening in the dark feels the stove warmth hold steady. Elias worked with a gentle focus that surprised even himself. He laid the girl on his own bed, piling furs and blankets on top of her small, trembling frame. Her breathing was shallow, a tiny, ragged sound in the quiet room. He stripped off her frozen, damp clothes, finding them to be of surprisingly fine make under their layer of grime and wear. A small wool dress, stitched with a skill he recognized from his wife's handiwork. This was no settler's child lost on a journey. He stoked the fire until the cabin was almost uncomfortably warm, then set a pot of water to heat. He remembered the herbs his wife Mary used to gather. Feverfew and willowbark she had called them, for calming fevers. He had a small supply left in a leather pouch, saved for his own rare illnesses. He crushed the dried leaves and bark, steeping them in the hot water to make a bitter tea. He propped the girl's head up, trying to coax a few spoonfuls of the warm liquid past her lips. Most of it dribbled down her chin, but some went down. It was a small victory. He spent the rest of the day and into the long night bathing her forehead with cool cloths, murmuring soft words of encouragement he hadn't spoken in years. The words felt foreign on his tongue, rusty from disuse. He told her she was safe, that the fire was warm, that morning would come. He spoke of the chickadees that flitted in the pines and the way the snow looked on the branches. He wasn't sure if she could hear him, but the sound of a human voice, his own, filled the crushing silence he had grown so accustomed to. He did not sleep. He sat by the bed, watching the tiny rise and fall of her chest, a fragile rhythm that held the entire world's weight. Sometime near dawn, the fever broke. The shivering stopped, and a light sheen of sweat appeared on her brow. Her breathing deepened, becoming more regular. Elias felt a wave of relief so profound it left him weak. He had not realized how tense he had been. A knot of fear clenched deep in his gut. He had not allowed himself to hope, to protect himself from the familiar pain of loss. Now, as the first light of morning filtered through the single window, he saw that her eyes were open. They were a deep, clear blue, and they watched him with a solemn, silent appraisal. She did not speak, did not make a sound. She simply watched him, her gaze old and weary in such a young face. He offered her a spoonful of broth he'd made from the rabbit, and this time she swallowed it. He felt a connection, a silent understanding pass between them. He had pulled her back from the edge, and in doing so, had found a part of himself he thought long dead. As he was carefully folding her tattered clothes, something small and hard fell from a pocket in the little dress. He picked it up. It was a small bird, carved from a piece of dark, polished wood, perhaps walnut. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each tiny feather rendered with incredible detail. It was not a simple whittled toy. This was the work of a master craftsman, a piece that spoke of money and a life far removed from this harsh wilderness. He held the wooden bird in his rough palm. It was a clue, a tiny piece of a puzzle he didn't understand. The girl in his bed was a mystery, and this small, perfect bird was the first word in her silent story. Where had she come from, and who was searching for her? He knew he could not keep her here forever. He would have to take her to town, to Aspen Creek. The thought of returning to civilization, of facing the questions and the stares, filled him with a familiar dread. But looking at the girl, her blue eyes still watching him, he knew it was a journey he had to make. He had become her keeper, and he would see this through. The mountain had tested him with cold and hunger, but this was a different kind of trial. The journey to Aspen Creek was slow and arduous. He fashioned a small sled from birch wood and rope, lining it with his softest furs to protect the girl from the jarring ride and the biting wind. He named her Sparrow in his mind, for her lightness and the way she watched everything with wide, silent eyes. She still had not spoken a single word since waking, her silence as vast and profound as the snow-covered landscape around them. She ate what he offered and allowed him to wrap her in blankets, but she remained a quiet, watchful presence. He hitched the sled to his belt and began the descent, his snowshoes sinking into the deep powder. The trip that took him half a day alone now stretched into 2 full days of careful, deliberate travel. He spoke to her constantly as they moved, pointing out the tracks of a snowshoe hare or the high, lonely circle of a hawk. He was talking as much for himself as for her, the sound of his voice a bulwark against the overwhelming quiet. They arrived in Aspen Creek as dusk was settling, the lights from the town's few buildings casting a warm, yellow glow on the snow. The town wasn't much, just a single muddy street lined with a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and the sheriff's office. Dogs barked as he pulled the sled down the main thoroughfare, and faces appeared in windows, curious about the mountain man in his strange cargo. Elias ignored them, his focus on the small wooden sign that read, Sheriff Miller. He pulled the sled to a halt and gently lifted the girl out, her small hand clutching the wooden bird he had returned to her. Sheriff Miller was a portly man with a kind face and tired eyes. He looked up from his paperwork as Elias entered, his expression shifting from mild surprise to concern as he saw the child. Elias explained the situation in spare, simple terms, how he had found her near frozen by the creek, her condition, her silence. Sheriff Miller listened patiently, nodding as Elias spoke. He leaned over his desk and offered the girl a piece of hard candy, which she accepted without a word, her eyes never leaving Elias's face. A lost child this time of year, that's a bad business, Miller said, stroking his thick mustache. We haven't had any reports. No one missing from town, and the last stagecoach came through 3 days ago, all passengers accounted for. He stood and walked over to a large ledger on a nearby table. The Trading Post ledger shows 3 names from last winter, but this one is new. Let's check the stage line's official log. He ran a thick finger down the columns of names and destinations. Nothing. No family with a child her age passed through in the last month? The sheriff sighed, closing the book. I don't know what to tell you, Elias. No one seems to be looking for her. This was not the answer Elias had expected. He had assumed she was from a family passing through, that her rescue would be a simple matter of reuniting her with her kin. Now, a more complicated reality began to settle in. She was an orphan, at least for now, a ghost child with no past and an uncertain future. The sheriff suggested she could stay with the preacher and his wife for the time being. But when he reached for her hand, the girl shrank back, pressing herself against Elias's leg. Her grip on his trousers was surprisingly strong. She looked up at him, her silent plea clear. In that moment, Elias knew he couldn't leave her. He had brought her down from the mountain, and for now she was his responsibility. She'll stay with me, Elias heard himself say, the words feeling both strange and right. The sheriff looked at him, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. It was a well-known fact that Elias Thorne kept to himself. He was a man who had turned his back on the world, yet here he was, claiming a lost child as his own. The sheriff nodded slowly. All right, Elias, but you check in with me every few days. If anyone comes looking, I'll know where to find you. Elias nodded, relief mixing with a new and heavy sense of duty. He was walking into a life he had long since abandoned, and it was all because of a silent little girl and a finely carved bird. The responsibility felt heavier than any pack he had ever carried. His quiet life was over, replaced by a future he could not yet imagine. Elias spent the next day in town, a place he usually avoided. With Sparrow in tow, her small hand now firmly in his, he moved through the unfamiliar currents of community life. His first stop was the general store, a place that smelled of coffee beans, leather, and smoked bacon. The proprietor, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Gable, watched him with undisguised suspicion as he bought a small pair of boots, a warm wool coat, and a length of soft flannel to fashion into a nightdress. He paid with the few pelts he had managed to trap before finding the girl, his plans for salt and flour replaced by the more immediate needs of his small charge. The whispers followed them as they left the store. People saw the rough mountain man in the silent, well-dressed child and drew their own conclusions, none of them charitable. Anyone who has ever felt judged knows the weight of those stares. Elias felt their gazes like a physical pressure, but he kept his shoulders straight, his focus entirely on the girl. He found them a room for the night at the town's modest boarding house. Sparrow explored the small, clean room with a quiet curiosity, her fingers tracing the pattern on the quilt in the smooth glass of the windowpane. That evening, as she sat on the floor by the small stove, Elias tried to teach her a simple game with pebbles, but she only watched, her expression unreadable. Frustration mingled with a deep, aching pity. What had happened to her to steal her voice and lock her away so completely? He took out the carved wooden bird and turned it over in his hands. It felt important, the only tangible link to her past. Later, as he was mending a tear in her old coat before packing it away, His fingers found a small, stiff lump sewn into the lining near the hem. His curiosity piqued. He carefully worked the stitches loose with the tip of his knife. Inside the hidden pocket was a small, folded piece of oilcloth. He unwrapped it carefully. It wasn't a letter or a map. It was a small printed ticket, a receipt from the Aspen Creek assay office. It was a claim ticket for a lock-strong box, number 73. And at the bottom, printed in a neat, clear hand, was a name. Silas Croft. The name meant nothing to him, but it was the first solid lead he had. Silas Croft. Was it her father's name? An uncle? A family friend? The ticket was dated only 3 weeks prior. Whatever had happened to this Silas Croft and to the girl had happened recently. He looked over at Sparrow, who had finally fallen asleep, curled up under the blankets, the wooden bird clutched in her hand. She looked so small, so vulnerable. He now had a name, a thread to pull on. Tomorrow he would go to the assay office. He would find out who Silas Croft was and what was in that box. The feeling of dread he had felt earlier was replaced by a surge of determination. He was no longer just a rescuer. He was an investigator, a protector with a purpose. He would uncover the truth of her past no matter where it led. The silence in the room was different now, filled not with emptiness, but with the soft breathing of a sleeping child and the weight of a secret waiting to be unlocked. The next morning, Elias left Sparrow in the care of the boarding house owner, a kind widow who promised to watch her for an hour. The girl's eyes followed him to the door, a flicker of fear in them that tightened his chest. He promised to be back soon, a vow he intended to keep. The assay office was a small, solid brick building at the end of the street, its windows barred with thick iron. It was where miners and prospectors brought their dust and ore to be weighed and valued, and where they often kept their valuables for safekeeping. The assayer, a thin, nervous man named Peterson, peered at Elias over his spectacles. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice reedy. Elias placed the claim ticket on the counter. "I'm here about box 73, for Silas Croft." Peterson's eyes widened slightly. He picked up the ticket, examining it closely. "This is Mr. Croft's ticket, yes, but I can't release the box to you. Strict policy. Only the owner can claim it." "Is he in town?" Elias asked, keeping his voice level. "Haven't seen him in a few weeks," Peterson said, polishing his spectacles with a cloth. "He made a deposit, a sizable one, and said he was heading back up to his claim near Devil's Head. Said he'd be back before the first heavy snow." Elias felt a knot of cold dread. Devil's Head was treacherous country, especially this time of year. If Croft had been caught in a storm, his chances were slim. Elias needed more information. His next stop was Henderson's trading post, the hub of all news and gossip in Aspen Creek. Henderson was a large man with a booming voice and an encyclopedic memory for his customers. Elias described Silas Croft, a man of medium height with dark hair, likely well-dressed. Henderson stroked his beard, his eyes distant in thought. Then he nodded. I remember him. Came in about 2 months back. Quiet fellow, but his money was good." He turned and pulled a heavy leather-bound book from under the counter. The Trading Post ledger shows 3 names from last winter, but this one is his own system. He ran a finger down a page. "Here we are, Silas Croft. Bought a new pickaxe, 3 canvas sacks, and enough provisions for a month. Paid in gold dust. Mentioned he was working a claim his father left him. Up on the north slope of Devil's Head." Just as Henderson finished speaking, the bell over the door chimed. A man entered, dressed in a fine city suit and a polished bowler hat that looked out of place in the rustic store. He was tall and slender, with a cold, assessing gaze. "Henderson," the man said, his voice smooth. "I need to see the latest claim filings." Henderson nodded toward the man. "Elias, this is Mr. Davies, from the Western Land and Mineral Company. He's been buying up claims in the area." Davies glanced at Elias, a dismissive flicker in his eyes before his attention was caught by the open ledger. He saw the name Elias was pointing to. "Silas Croft," Davies said, a strange stillness in his voice. "I know that name. He was a hopeful amateur. I bought his claim from him last month. A worthless piece of rock, but my company buys everything. He took his money and said he was heading back east to St. Louis." The story was smooth, plausible, but it contradicted what the assayer had said about Croft returning to his claim. One of them was lying. As Elias processed this, he glanced out the store's dusty window. He saw the boarding house owner walking down the street, holding Sparrow's hand. She was taking the girl for a short walk. As they passed the trading post, Sparrow looked inside. Her eyes met Mr. Davies's. The reaction was instantaneous and visceral. The girl's face went pale. She let out a tiny choked gasp and tried to hide behind the woman's skirts, her body trembling. And in that moment, Elias heard her first word, a terrified whisper that was almost silent. Bad. It was all the confirmation he needed. Davies was not just a liar, he was the source of the girl's terror. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a dark and dangerous picture. He had to get the girl away from this town, away from this man. But he also knew he couldn't run until he had the truth. The child's whispered word echoed in Elias's mind, a small, sharp key turning a very dark lock. He knew with a certainty that settled like a cold stone in his gut, that Mr. Davies was deeply connected to the disappearance of Silas Croft. He needed proof, something more than a terrified child's reaction and conflicting stories. The strongbox at the assay office was the key. He returned to Sheriff Miller's office, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. He explained everything. The claim ticket, the assayer's story, Henderson's ledger, and Davies's contradictory claim. He finished with the girl's reaction, her single damning word. Miller listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each detail. Davies, he mused, tapping his fingers on his desk. He's been here about 6 months, throws a lot of money around, represents a powerful company back east. He's smooth, but there's something about him that's always rubbed me the wrong way. The girl is a witness to something, Elias said, his voice low and urgent. Davies knows it. She isn't safe here. Miller nodded in agreement. But we have no hard evidence. A judge would laugh us out of court based on what we have. Davies' word against a mountain man and a child who won't speak. He looked at Elias, his gaze steady. The assayer's log. That's a legal document. If Croft made a deposit after Davies claims he left, that's a crack in his story. Together, they walked back to the assay office. Peterson, the assayer, was visibly nervous with the sheriff present. Miller was firm but calm. Peterson, I need to see your official deposit log for the last month. Reluctantly, Peterson produced another large ledger. Miller opened it, running his finger down the dated entries. The assay office log shows Silas Croft's signature next to a deposit entry. The date was exactly 3 weeks ago, a full week after Davies claimed to have bought the claim and sent Croft on his way. The signature was firm and clear. Silas Croft had been in this office, alive and well, long after he had supposedly left the territory. This is something, Miller said quietly, closing the book. It's proof Davies is lying about the timeline, but it's not proof of anything worse. As they stood there contemplating their next move, Sparrow, who had been brought to the sheriff's office for safety, began to tug on Elias's sleeve. She pointed a small, trembling finger toward a map of the county hanging on the wall. She walked over to it, her eyes scanning the topographical lines. Then her finger stopped on a specific peak, a rugged and isolated spire on the northern edge of the territory. Devil's Head. She looked back at Elias, her blue eyes wide and filled with a terrible knowledge. She couldn't tell him what happened there, but she could show him where it began. In that moment, Elias knew what he had to do. The answers weren't in Aspen Creek. They were up on that mountain, at Silas Croft's abandoned claim. It was a dangerous journey into the heart of winter, into the very place that held the girl's dark secret. But he knew he had to go. He had to find out what happened to Silas Croft for her sake. He arranged for Sparrow to stay with the preacher's wife, a gentle, gray-haired woman named Martha Gable. The thought of leaving the girl, even for a few days, was difficult, but taking her with him was impossible. The mountain held its own kind of justice, and he was going to find it. He would be the voice for the man who had been silenced and the protector for the daughter he had left behind. The trail to Devil's Head was little more than a whisper on the landscape, a faint path used only by prospectors and the hardiest of hunters. Elias urged his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Boulder, through snow that deepened with every upward mile. The air grew thin and sharp, and the wind carried a biting chill that promised more snow to come. He traveled with a light pack, taking only what was essential, his senses on high alert. He knew he was not just racing against the weather, but also against time. If Davies discovered he was heading for the claim, the land agent would surely send someone to stop him. He made camp the first night in a sheltered overhang of rock, building a small, smokeless fire that offered little warmth but allowed him to heat some coffee. The loneliness of the high country, once his comfort, now felt menacing. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of a distant owl made him reach for his rifle. He thought of Sparrow safe in the preacher's warm house, and the image gave him strength. On the second day, his instincts screamed that he was being followed. He saw no one, heard nothing out of the ordinary, but the feeling persisted, a prickling on the back of his neck. He began to use his old skills, doubling back on his own trail, using rocky ground where he could to hide his tracks. Late in the afternoon from a high ridge, he saw him, a lone rider far below, moving steadily along the path Elias had just left. The man was bundled against the cold, but he rode with a purpose that was unmistakable. Davies had sent his man. The game had changed. This was no longer just a search for truth. It was a race for survival. Elias pushed on, his pace now urgent. He reached the area Henderson had described, the north slope of Devil's Head, as the light began to fail. He found the camp tucked into a small wind-scoured basin. It was a simple setup, a canvas lean-to against a rock wall, a fire pit, and a scattering of tools. The place had been ransacked. The canvas was slashed, sacks of provisions were torn open, and their contents scattered in the snow. Whoever had done this had been looking for something. Elias searched the camp carefully, his eyes missing nothing. He found little of value, just the debris of a simple, hard life. Then he saw it, tucked into a crevice in the rock wall, something the searcher had missed. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover stiff with frozen damp. He took it to the lean-to, shielding his small lantern from the wind as he carefully opened it. Much of the ink had run, the pages a blur of meaningless smudges. But near the back, a few pages were mostly legible. He could make out words, phrases. Incredible luck. Vein of pure silver, like a frozen river running through the rock. Must file the claim properly. Meeting with Davies from the land company tomorrow. He says he can handle the paperwork in Denver. The last entry was dated the day before Silas Croft had made his final deposit at the assay office. Croft hadn't been selling a worthless claim. He had found a fortune. Davies had known it, and he had lied about it. As Elias read the last words, a gust of wind blew through the tattered canvas, and he heard the crunch of snow outside. Not the soft sound of a deer, but the heavy tread of a man in boots. The man following him had arrived. Elias extinguished his lantern, plunging the lean-to into absolute darkness. He drew his knife, its cold steel a familiar weight in his hand, and flattened himself against the rock wall. He heard the man's heavy breathing just outside the canvas. The silence stretched, tight and deadly. The mountain was about to witness another confrontation. The truth was here, in this frozen, desolate place, and he would have to fight his way out with it. He knew the man outside was not there to talk. The shadow of a man fell across the canvas entrance of the lean-to. Elias held his breath, every muscle coiled and ready. The man outside was cautious, listening. Elias could hear the soft scrape of a boot on stone. He had one advantage, the darkness. He knew the layout of this small shelter. The man outside did not. The canvas flap was pushed aside and a large figure stooped to enter, a pistol held ready in his hand. In that split second, Elias moved. He lunged forward, not at the man, but at the stack of empty crates next to the entrance. He shoved them with all his might. The crates tumbled into the man, knocking him off balance with a grunt of surprise. The pistol discharged with a deafening roar, the flash momentarily illuminating a face with a thick beard and cruel small eyes. The bullet tore through the canvas roof and into the night sky. Elias didn't wait. He scrambled out the back of the lean-to where it met the rock face, using a gap the wind had torn in the fabric. He was outside in the biting cold and the relative safety of the rocks. He could hear the man cursing as he untangled himself from the crates. Elias didn't run. Running in the dark in this terrain was a fool's game. He found cover behind a large boulder and waited, his own rifle now in his hands. It was a standoff. "Thorne!" The man's voice called out, a rough, gravelly sound. "Davies just wants the journal. Give it to me and you can walk away." Elias remained silent. The man was lying. Davies couldn't afford a witness. "Have it your way," the man growled. A long silence followed, broken only by the incessant whine of the wind. Elias knew the man was circling, trying to find a better angle. Elias had a decision to make. He could wait for morning, but the man was between him and his horse, or he could end this now. He thought of Sparrow's terrified face. He had made a silent promise to her, and he would not fail. He began to move, a shadow among shadows, his snowshoes making no sound on the wind-packed snow. He used the terrain to his advantage, circling wider than the man would expect. He found what he was looking for, a steep, snow-filled gully that led down below the camp. He slid down it, the cold powder rushing over him, and came up 50 yards below his pursuer. He now had the high ground. He crept back up the slope, his movements slow and deliberate, until he could see the man's silhouette against the snow, peering at the boulder where Elias had first hidden. The man was exposed. Elias could have shot him. The thought was there, a cold, simple solution. But that was not his way. He raised his rifle and fired, not at the man, but at the rock just beside his head. The bullet ricocheted with a high-pitched scream, and chips of granite sprayed the man's face. He cried out in surprise and pain, dropping his pistol and stumbling back. "Leave!" Elias's voice boomed, magnified by the cold, still air. "Ride out now and don't look back." The man needed no further encouragement. He scrambled for his horse, fear giving him speed, and galloped away into the darkness. Elias waited until the sound of the hoofbeats faded completely. He was alone again. He retrieved the dropped pistol and went back to the camp. He knew he had to leave, but something nagged at him. Where had Davy's man hidden Croft's body? It had to be close. He relit his lantern and began a systematic search of the area around the camp. Behind the lean-to, near a cluster of young pines, he saw it. A patch of earth and rock that was disturbed. The snow on top of it melted and refrozen. It was a crude, shallow grave. He began to dig with the prospector's abandoned shovel. The ground was frozen solid, the work grueling. But after an hour of chipping away at the icy soil, he found him. Silas Croft. He had the final, terrible piece of the puzzle. He had the journal, and he had the body. Now all he had to do was get back to Aspen Creek alive. The journey back was a blur of exhaustion and grim determination. He knew Davies would be desperate now. The return to Aspen Creek felt like descending from a harsh alien world into one of simple, sunlit truths. Elias rode not with haste, but with a hunter's caution, choosing paths that kept him hidden from the main trail. He arrived well after midnight, the town sleeping under a blanket of stars. He didn't go to the boarding house. He went directly to Sheriff Miller's home, a small house behind the jail. He banged on the door until a light appeared, and the sheriff, pulling on his trousers, opened it. Miller's weary expression sharpened when he saw Elias's face, etched with fatigue and the grim knowledge of what he'd found. Elias stepped inside, the warmth of the room a welcome shock. He placed the frozen journal on the table. "Croft found a major silver strike," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's all in there. Davies knew. He killed him for it." He proceeded to tell Miller everything, the confrontation with the hired man and the discovery of the shallow grave. Miller listened without interruption, his face a grim mask. When Elias finished, the sheriff was silent for a long moment. "I believe you, Elias," he said finally, "but a man's body buried on a mountain and a half-ruined journal aren't enough to convict a man like Davies. His company will hire the best lawyers money can buy. They'll say you killed Croft yourself for the claim." The logic was cold and disheartening, but Elias knew it was true. He had the truth, but he didn't have the kind of proof that would stand up in a court of law. As they sat in the quiet kitchen, the town's telegraph machine, located in a small corner of the sheriff's office next door, suddenly clattered to life. The sound was sharp and intrusive in the pre-dawn silence. Miller went to check it, his curiosity piqued by the late hour of the message. He returned a few minutes later, a strip of paper in his hand, his eyes wide with a new light. Anyone who has seen hope arrive unexpectedly knows that look. He handed the paper to Elias. It was a telegram from the U.S. Marshal in Denver. A Miss Eleanor Croft had filed a missing person report for her brother Silas. She stated that her brother was a meticulous man who wrote to her every week. The letters had stopped 3 weeks ago. She was concerned, especially after he had written to her about a significant mineral discovery and his plans to meet with an agent from the Western Land and Mineral Company. The telegram ended with a crucial piece of information. The sister had provided a copy of her brother's last letter. In it, Silas had mentioned a unique detail for security. The official deed to his claim, which he was picking up from the county seat, would be sealed with his family's signet ring, an image of a hawk. He planned to place that deed, along with his will, in a secure box at the Aspen Creek Assay Office. The land deed carries an old stamp, a family seal. Elias and Miller looked at each other. The proof was not on the frozen mountain. It had been in Aspen Creek all along, locked away in strong box number 73. Davies might have a bill of sale, likely forged, but the box contained the true legally filed deed, his last will and testament, and a seal that would prove its authenticity beyond any doubt. Davies doesn't know about the sister or the seal, Miller said, a grim smile touching his lips. He thinks all he has to do is get rid of you and the girl, and he's home free. They now had the upper hand. They had a witness in Denver, a legal document waiting to be opened, and the element of surprise. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the snow-covered town. It was time to end this. The final confrontation would not be fought with guns in the wilderness, but with truth and evidence in the heart of the town. The law, which had seemed so distant and ineffective, was about to arrive with undeniable force. Morning broke, clear and cold. Sheriff Miller gathered a small posse of 2 deputies he trusted implicitly. The plan was simple and direct. They would confront Davies at the hotel where he kept a room, with a warrant to search his belongings for a forged bill of sale, and another warrant to open Croft's strongbox. Elias's role was to be a witness. He waited in the sheriff's office with Martha Gable and Sparrow. The girl seemed to sense the tension in the air. She sat close to Elias, her hand clutching his, her eyes wide and watchful. The preacher's wife had done her best to calm her, but the child's fear was a palpable thing. Miller and his deputies walked across the street to the hotel. A few minutes later they emerged, escorting a surprised and indignant Mr. Davies. He was still impeccably dressed, but his smooth composure had a brittle edge. "This is an outrage, Sheriff," he protested loudly, for the benefit of the few townspeople who had started to gather. "My company will hear of this harassment." Miller ignored him, marching him down the street to the assay office. Peterson, the assayer, was wringing his hands, his face pale with anxiety. With the sheriff, his deputies, and Elias present, he unlocked the vault and retrieved strong box number 73. It was a heavy iron-bound box. "I demand to see a warrant for this," Davies snapped, his voice tight. Miller produced the document, signed by the circuit judge who had been reached by telegraph. The assayer used a set of keys to open the box. As the lid was lifted, everyone leaned in. Inside, on top of a stack of papers, was a canvas bag heavy with gold dust and a small, leather-bound book. Underneath was a thick vellum document, folded and tied with a ribbon. And pressed into the wax that sealed the ribbon was a perfect, unmistakable image of a soaring hawk. The crate bears a mine mark that matches the seal. Miller carefully broke the seal and unrolled the document. It was the official, notarized deed for the Devil's Head silver claim, registered in the name of Silas Croft. Attached to it was a handwritten last will and testament, leaving everything he owned to his only living heir, his daughter, Lily Croft. Elias looked down at the girl beside him. Lily. She had a name. Davies' face had lost all its color. He stared at the deed as if it were a snake. "That's a forgery," he stammered. "I have a bill of sale." "Show it to me," Miller said, his voice like cold iron. Davies hesitated, but the deputy beside him gave him a sharp nudge. He produced a document from his inner coat pocket. Miller took it and compared the signature on the bill of sale to the one in the assayer's ledger and on Croft's will. "The signature is a decent forgery," Miller announced to the silent room. But he made one mistake. He spelled Silas with a Y instead of an I. All eyes turned to Davies. His composure finally shattered. He made a desperate lunge for the deputy's pistol, but he was too slow. He was subdued in seconds, the fight gone out of him. At that moment, Sparrow, now Lily, who had been silent through the entire ordeal, stepped forward. She looked at the captured Davies, her small face resolute. She pointed a steady finger at him and spoke, her voice clear and strong, a sound no one in the room had ever heard from her. "He pushed Papa," she said, "into the rocks." The child's testimony, simple and direct, landed with the force of a final, unanswerable judgment. The case was closed. The room was silent, the truth finally laid bare by a little girl who had found her voice when it mattered most. Elias knelt and put his arm around her. She looked up at him, her blue eyes clear and, for the first time, free of fear. She had found her protector, and he had found a purpose he never knew he was seeking. The long winter of silence was over, for both of them. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet transition. The harsh grip of winter began to loosen, and the first signs of spring appeared in the high country. The snow receded from the meadows, and the creek behind Elias's cabin began to flow freely again. News came that Davies and his hired man had confessed fully, and that Lily's aunt, Eleanor, was making the long journey from St. Louis to see to her niece's affairs. The silver mine, officially named the Lily, was placed in a trust to be managed for the girl until she came of age. Elias was formally named her temporary guardian. He and Lily returned to his mountain cabin, the place that had been his refuge from the world now becoming a home for them both. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound of Lily's questions, her laughter, and the stories she was beginning to tell about her father. She was a bright, curious child, and as the trauma faded, her true personality emerged. She followed Elias everywhere, helping him with his chores, gathering firewood, and checking the snares. He taught her the names of the trees and the birds, the way to read the weather in the clouds, and how to be quiet and still in the woods. He found himself rediscovering the mountains through her eyes, seeing the wonder in things he had long taken for granted. He repaired her father's carved wooden bird, which had been chipped in her fall, its smooth form once again perfect. She kept it on the mantelpiece, a quiet memorial to the man they both honored. One sunny afternoon in late April, they worked together in a small patch of earth Elias had cleared for a garden. He showed her how to plant seeds for carrots and peas, pressing them into the dark, rich soil. She handled the tiny seeds with a focused determination that reminded him of her father. As they worked side by side, a comfortable silence settled between them. Elias looked at the small girl, her face smudged with dirt, her expression serious as she patted the earth over a row of seeds. He thought of the man he had been just a few months ago, a solitary figure haunted by loss, living a life as gray and still as a winter sky. Now his world was filled with color and purpose. He had not sought this new life, but it had found him, a small lost bird he had nursed back to health. He knew her aunt would arrive soon, and decisions would have to be made about Lily's future. The thought of her leaving left a hollow ache in his chest, an ache he recognized as the fear of loss. But he pushed it away. For now she was here. For now they were a family, forged not by blood, but by circumstance, in a shared journey through darkness into light. Lily looked up at him and smiled, a bright, genuine smile that reached her clear blue eyes. "When the carrots grow, can we eat them right out of the ground?" she asked. Elias smiled back, a true smile that softened the hard lines of his face. "We can," he said. "That's the best way." They continued their work, their hands in the earth, planting the seeds of a future neither could have imagined. The sun warmed their backs, and the sound of the creek murmured nearby. High on the mountain, away from the laws and judgments of men, Elias Thorne had found his way home. The silence was finally filled, not with memories of the past, but with the promise of a new season.